I'm simply trying to remind us all of how we got here and remind Alejandro of who the hell I am. This is Bedtime Stories, Grownup Edition, Operation Anteater, Part 11. When the roundtable ended on Saturday evening, everyone in attendance got busy with their own lives. They all came together again on Sunday for church service and the dedication of all of the new children in the family. And if you watch bonus episode 2, parts 1 and 2, you know all about the drama that ensued. So on Monday morning, the heads in training, their right hands, and the generals were all ready to pick up where they'd left off. Angela arrived back at the Lopez estate right before breakfast, just in enough time to bend Q's ear. She said, "Hey baby, how was your night?" Q said, "Very interesting. Sincere's mind is as degenerate as we thought it was. I can't wait to tell you all about it tonight. And I know you may not want to, but I think it may be a good idea for you to have a conversation with LJ. He needs to know where you stand." Angela said, "I have no problem with doing that after the night I had, and I can't wait to tell you about it." That damn Regina is something else. I let her goat and bait me into a knockout drag-out argument and said things that I probably shouldn't have, but it was like I had a battery in my back and I just couldn't reel myself back in. And once I started unloading on her, I could not stop. Q said, "I'm sure that everything you said, she needed to hear, even if she didn't want to." Angela said, "You're probably right. That's the same thing her mother said. But we're going to have to talk about that later because it's almost time for breakfast. I just wanted to know if you had that follow-up conversation with Michael." Q said, "I did, but can I give you some unsolicited advice?" When Angela said yes, Q said, "You're going to have to stop overplaying your role with Regina. Start dealing with her how she deals with you. Hardly, barely, and accordingly." Angela said, "That's a hard pill to swallow." Q said, "I'm sure it is." Then he said, "As for Michael, we talked. It's time that Melissa goes back to school." All of the other children attended the Denton Christian Academy right there in Denton, Texas. But Melissa attended the Light, a spiritual school located in the mountains of North Carolina. She'd been at home attending school online since her almost abduction at the start of the war against the International Trafficking Organization. Angela asked, "What exactly occurred in your conversation with Michael?" Q summarized the conversation for Angela, and then he said, "He wants to come home for Melissa's Sweet 16 and have him return to St. Lucia with him." When I asked why he wanted to wait for a party that hadn't even been planned yet, he said that Spider wouldn't want to miss it. When I asked why, he gave me this little sneaky smirk and said, "Come on, Pops. You can't put 2 and 2 together." And then Angela fell out laughing. It was not hard to tell that Michael's best friend Spider had a Jones for Melissa. And judging by Melissa's facial expressions when Spider called her, the feeling was mutual. Q said, "I don't find anything about that funny. She's too young." Angela said, "You didn't say that when Michael was pursuing Tamara. They are only 4 months apart. They're the same age, 8 months out the year." Q said, "But it's different when..." Angela said, "Please don't say anything sexist or misogynistic. Now, what's this about a Sweet 16? I know that Uncle Manny had promised to give Melissa an old school quinceañera, but with everything going on with the traffickers, that had to be canceled. But she hasn't said anything to me about turning it into a Sweet 16. Has she mentioned it to you?" Q said, "Nah, I hate to admit it, but I haven't really tapped in with her. I promised to give her some one-on-one time once this roundtable wraps. But I bet that if you bring it up to Manny, he'll know all about it, since he's the one who made the initial promise. I'm sure she followed up." Q walked Angela over to the Lopez table, and after salutations and breakfast was served, Angela turned to Manny and asked him about the party. Manny said, "Well, that was quick. Did you like it? Melissa designed the invitations herself." Angela said, "What invitation?" Manny said, "Oh, I thought maybe you'd received the invitation to the party. They started going out on Wednesday. You and Q should have yours early this week." Angela said, "Wait a minute. You planned a Sweet 16 party for our daughter and sent us invitations without even having a conversation with us about it?" Manny said, "Mija, I didn't plan the party. Melissa did. And you know that girl is like my little broke best friend." Well, actually, she isn't broke. That girl got more money than I'd ever seen at her age. Angela said, "Come again?" Manny said, "A little birdie told me that the soldiers have been going to Melissa for spiritual advice. And while she won't accept payment, she has been taking offerings." and everybody at the table fell out laughing. Angela said, "Oh dear God, she's turned her spiritual gifts into a commodity?" Manny said, No. She's been using her gifts for their intended purpose. She's been blessing them, and in return, they've been choosing to bless her. And as I understand, she's been a good steward of those resources. Angela asked, "How so?" Manny said, "She's been paying tithes and donating 50% of what's remaining." And Angela almost cried. Melissa never ceased to amaze her, but she had some concerns about Melissa taking money from adults she didn't know anything about. And when she said as much, Manny said, "Before you call her to the carpet, you may want to have a conversation with the little birdie who told me." And then he told Angela that Mom Brenda was the little birdie. Both Angela and Q had been rather busy, and neither of them had been tapping in with Melissa or Angel as much as they should have been. But Angela was glad to hear that Melissa was at least running things by her Nana Brenda. She was pretty sure that she was probably running the situation with Spider by her Nana Brenda too. When breakfast ended, the necessary parties all convened in the main meeting room. Q said, "We are back on the record, ladies and gentlemen. Following the agenda, it's time that we discuss the situation with Saint Montclair." Catherine said, "Saint is doing well. He'll be coming home soon. He had a hearing where his attorney presented the evidence that we had all along to prove his innocence. And his attorney is pretty confident that the judge will rule in his favor and dismiss all charges with prejudice, meaning that Saint could never be charged with the crime that he'd been accused of ever again." Alejandro asked, "So what is that going to mean for his ability to continue as a finisher for the Five Families?" Catherine said, "Well, now that his prints and his DNA are in NCIC, neither he nor we can risk him continuing in his current role. But I'm sure that we will be able to make good use of his talents in another position." When Sincere asked, "What other position?" Catherine said, "That's something I'll need to discuss with him first." Q said, "If no one else has anything to add on the Saint situation, let's move on to the business deal with the Tanakas." Then Sincere gave his recap of the job that he and the covert had done in Japan. He finished by saying, "When we returned to the U.S., the deal was signed, and all 5 of the families are now in a multi-year $50 million legitimate business contract with the Tanaka Enterprise and the Ortiz family out of Puerto Rico." Everyone applauded. Some of the heads even got up and slapped Sincere on the back. And while he was still soaking up all of the glory, Catherine said, "I am so proud of the work that you did in Japan, Sincere. I wish that I could say all you did was broker a successful business deal." Confused, everybody looked at one another, looked at Sincere, and looked at Catherine. Then Catherine said, "As you all know, Saint was initially arrested in Paris. He was there on an assignment for the St. James family in order to properly train Sincere. But what some of you may not know is that was one of 7 assignments that I personally oversaw. The operation included taking out 7 women. All 7 of those women were the mistresses of my husband when he met his untimely demise." Alejandro said, "Wait a minute. So are you telling me that Saint is in a federal prison in Arkansas because you sent him and his brother on personal missions, and you are the one who's at fault for him being made in Paris?" Catherine said, "No, I am not at fault for him being made in Paris. And it was within my purview to train Sincere however I saw fit. Let's be honest. The entire war with the International Trafficking Organization was personal. They came after the families because of a lifelong vendetta that they had against Big Wood, and because Q's work with the feds had gotten him a little too close for comfort. This began with your family, Alejandro. Your cousin, God rest the dead, left his family in the care of a man who was employed by the International Trafficking Organization, and Big Wood said, 'That's enough.' Catherine said, 'I don't mean any disrespect. I'm simply trying to remind us all of how we got here and remind Alejandro of who the hell I am.' Like I was saying, Sincere's job in Japan was twofold: to secure the business arrangement and to take out Nigel's 7th mistress. Because the situation was delicate, he wasn't the one who was going to actually pull the trigger. And as you all know, he wasn't alone in Japan. Not only did he have soldiers, 2 lieutenants, and a general at his disposal, but he was there with a covert." Idris said, "Wait a minute. I thought that he was there with the Ortiz family heiress." Catherine said, "No. He was there with one of my coverts who was pretending to be the Ortiz heiress. And it was her job to get Nigel's mistress in a compromising position and ensure that she didn't get out of it. Then Manny asked a question that he already knew the answer to. He said, Catherine, for the good of the group, who exactly was Nigel's mistress? Then Catherine said, Suki Tanaka. And the whole room erupted. Idris said, I know damn well you didn't have the Tanaka heiress knocked off. Catherine said, no, I didn't. Idris said, oh, thank God. Then Catherine patched in the covert, whose identity was blurred and voice was altered. In the covert, Courtney explained exactly how Suki Tanaka managed to avoid losing her life. Courtney said, so the plan was falling into place, and then Suki Tanaka threw a monkey wrench. She asked to meet with me for lunch, alone. And over lunch, she dropped a whole lot in my lap. 6 months earlier, in Japan, Courtney sat across from Suki, and she understood why Catherine wanted her gone. She had no problem with following the plan, but something about the woman in front of her and the story that she just told had Courtney thinking that Catherine and Suki would make good friends, or at the very least, very good business partners, because they were playing for the same team. She could also tell that Suki's death would set off an earthquake in the Tanaka enterprise that would trigger a tsunami that would absolutely reach the five families' legitimate and illegitimate businesses. But it wasn't her call. What she knew was Catherine was not the type of woman who you haphazardly suggested a change of plans to. You followed her orders to the letter, or you'd be risking your job or your head. If a change was to be made, it needed to be Catherine's idea. So Courtney decided that if Catherine asked her opinion, she'd give it. She'd also give her a very thorough debrief, one that would not include how that conversation ended. When the conversation finally moved from personal to business, Suki gave Courtney, Gabriella, some really great advice. And Courtney said, I'm going to take everything you shared with me today under consideration, and I truly appreciate your advice. Speaking of which, you know who gives really great business advice? I've learned a lot from her, and I think you could learn a lot from her too. Suki asked to whom Courtney was referring. Courtney said, Catherine St. James. Have the two of you ever met? When Suki said that they hadn't, Courtney did not miss the moment that the light bulb turned on for Suki. When Courtney got back to her room and she called Catherine, Catherine said, tell me everything. And then Courtney said, well, for starters, I was early and she was even earlier. And she was dressed to impress in a Gabriella Hearst navy blue skirt business suit and a pair of matching 5-inch Louboutins. Catherine said, I'd expect the daughter of the Tanaka enterprise to have good and expensive taste. Courtney said, and I checked. The suit was from this year's line, and the Louboutins are unreleased. When Catherine made her look like she was impressed, Courtney said, exactly. Then she said, out the gate, she started asking me about my life. So I filled her in on the life of Gabriella Ortiz. And she was a very active listener, adding in bits and pieces from her own life that resembled the life of Gabriella. When I was done, she started telling me things that I'm sure very few other people know. Catherine said, like what? Courtney said, I don't know if you're ready for this. Catherine said, don't play with me, girl. Spit it out. Courtney said, okay. Well, she started pointing out the cultural differences between Puerto Rico and Japan, how relationships are handled in her culture. Catherine said, let me guess, in her culture, it's perfectly fine to sleep with somebody else's husband for decades. Courtney said, yes and no. In perfect English, slightly accented, Suki said, in my culture, marriages are arranged. The absence of offspring means that a marriage has failed, in which case a man is free to divorce his wife and marry another, even if that wife isn't the reason for any infertility issues. When the two have found love, it's not uncommon for them to remain in the marriage and have an understanding of sorts. The men are free to pursue other avenues to obtain an heir and a few possibles. You need to be open to the possibility that if you're unable to produce an heir in the first year or two of marriage, Sincere may exercise that same option, even if it's not necessarily customary in your culture. Because as I understand, that's what his father did. And it was at that moment that Courtney realized that Suki had never been Catherine's rival, and she'd never seen her role as mistress as interference in his marriage to Catherine. Suki had confided that her engagement had been called off because at her level and her would-be husband's level, they didn't take the risk of getting married and then finding out that there would be infertility issues. They underwent extensive medical testing to identify medical issues, genetic traits, and reproductive compatibility issues before the deal was sealed. And when it was discovered that Suki was infertile, both families quickly agreed to call off the pending nuptials because it wouldn't have been to either family's advantage for the two young people to enter into a marriage that would not produce biological heirs. IVF wasn't even an option because Suki suffered from POI, primary ovarian insufficiency, a condition in which the ovaries completely stop functioning. They fail to produce normal amounts of estrogen and or stop releasing eggs prior to the onset of menopause. One of Suki's ovaries had stopped working before she turned 16. And the other was nearly at failure when the medical tests were completed. So her intended withdrew his proposal and married a second woman who his family clearly had already had in the reserves because the two were married within 6 months. Because of her infertility, her father was unable to find her another prospect. So he shifted his attention to simply identifying men who were widowed, already had heirs, and their wealth and continued earning potential rivaled his own. Suki had said, somewhere along the way, I met a man whose wife was also infertile. Since I was no longer required to remain pure, it was culturally acceptable for he and I to begin a romance. I ended that romance when I learned that his wife was not of the same mind, but he and I remained friends until his death. And I never passed up an opportunity to encourage him to confess it all to his wife, because I believed that she deserved to know. Not only had he been involved in an extramarital affair with me, but he'd had the unmitigated gall to produce a number of offspring with an entirely other woman, completely unbeknownst to his wife. Or at least that's what he believed. I believe that she was too smart for that, and he was just too stupid to realize it. When Courtney finished relaying all of this to Catherine, Catherine said, I know full well you do not want me to believe that she had no idea that you knew she was talking about Nigel. Courtney said, no, she knew that I knew. Because she said, I'm sure you are aware that the man I'm referring to is the father of your fiance, which is even more reason why you should prepare yourself for the possibility that your soon-to-be husband will not be faithful. Catherine said, and what did you say? Courtney said, I said I'm sure that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Back at the round table, Catherine said, the day after Suki's lunch with who she believed was Gabriella Ortiz, all of the powers that be sat down to sign the contract. And when the lawyer placed the contract in front of Suki, she said that she couldn't sign it. The entire room was in an uproar, according to Sincere. And when asked why not, Sincere said that she wouldn't sign it until she had an opportunity to meet with Catherine St. James. I tried to talk her out of it, but she insisted that there'd be no deal unless she sat down with Catherine. Catherine said, when Sincere called me and told me that, I was pissed. I had zero interest in sitting down with any woman who'd been in my husband's bed, regardless of what she knew when she knew it, or when that ill-advised relationship had come to an end. But for the good of the group, I decided to tuck my pride. Imagine my surprise when I sat down with Suki Tanaka and realized that she was a woman I wanted to know. So taking her out was no longer a beneficial option. Idris said, look at God. And the Queen Mother elbowed him. Manny chuckled, and Alejandro said, it sounds like your covert deserves a raise, a promotion, something. And Courtney said, I concur. And everyone in the room laughed. And then Manny said, do you mind sharing the details of your conversation with her, or was that personal? Catherine said, there were some things said that I will absolutely share, but there were some things that were very personal. When Courtney had informed the round table of all that transpired during her lunch with Suki Tanaka, she'd followed Catherine's instructions to the letter. Catherine had told her to keep it simple as it pertained to the personal details that Suki had shared, and keep all of her emphasis on the great business advice Suki had given her. And when Catherine shared how her discussion with Suki resulted in the two women becoming allies, she didn't share any of the details around how that meeting began. 6 months earlier in Japan, Catherine had negotiated to ensure that the meeting occurred on her turf. Well, technically, they were in Japan, so it wasn't really her turf, but it was held at a safe house that her deceased husband had procured. It was crawling with St. James soldiers, and the meeting would be held in a room where the surveillance system was disabled. When Suki arrived, she found Catherine seated in an oversized plush sitting chair with a full tea service and finger foods already laid out. Catherine was such a lady. She was also a bad bee. So having a heads up about how Suki entered the room, Catherine had to ensure that she wasn't half-stepping. She had 3-carat canary diamonds in each ear, 7 carats around her neck, 10 on her wrist, and her 5-carat diamond canary engagement ring prominently positioned on her left ring finger. She was dressed in unreleased Chanel, customized to fit her petite, shapely but chiseled frame. The almond-colored suit included a $16,000 jacket, a $4,000 miniskirt, and a $3,000 pill cap fitted with a demure veil. And on her feet, she was wearing matching $1,000 Jimmy Choos. And Suki Tanaka had come dressed for the occasion as well. But this time, instead of a skirt suit, she was wearing an off-white Tom Ford slim-fit blazer with pleated skinny pants. Under her arm was a Dior purse, and on her feet were the matching Dior pumps. She walked into the room and said, "Mrs. St. James, it is an honor to make your acquaintance. Let me start by giving you my most sincere apology. Several decades ago, I dishonored you, completely unbeknownst to me. And before I sit down across from you and sip tea and break bread, I need you to know that I would never conspire with anyone, especially not a man, to disrespect the sanctity of a union that he'd entered into under terms that he'd had no intention of honoring." Catherine said, "Have a seat and tell me more." When Suki Tanaka was done telling Catherine how she'd met Nigel St. James, how their affair began, and how it ended, Catherine asked, "Did you end the affair because you discovered that you weren't his only mistress, or because you had issue with the way in which he'd handled me?" Suki said, "Absolutely the latter. I couldn't have cared less about the former. I didn't know if Nigel was just stupid, delusional, mentally ill, because he actually believed that you were not aware that his philandering had resulted in an illegitimate child. But whatever his malfunction, I didn't want to end up dead. The deed was certainly not worth my life." And both women laughed. And Suki said, "Now, I was willing to continue our business relationship, but our romantic relationship ended the day he told me that Sincere had been born." Catherine said, "So you've known about Sincere all of this time?" And Suki said, "I have. I encouraged him to tell you. And every time he reported that another child had been added to his ill-advised relationship with Annabelle, I strongly suggested that he tell you. And each time, I was that much more sorry that I'd ever become romantically involved with him. Do you believe that you can find it in your heart to forgive me?" And when Catherine said, "Done," Suki said, "Thank you. Now would you do me a favor and call Sincere and the woman pretending to be Gabriella Ortiz and let them know that you've decided to let me live?"
Solid, I stay out the way, yeah. Mama, business, get money and pray. Ain't gotta flex, my life say enough. Been through the struggle, I came out tough. Stay in my lane, I don't do the extra. Peace over drama, that's how I'm better. Real